Welcome to another episode of the Ambitious Legacy podcast. I'm your host, Sabine, the Purpose Lawyer. Thank you for listening and thank you for helping me be on purpose. So, guys, before I get into this episode, I wanted to talk to you about something that I have coming up. So, if you're a fan of the show, if you've been watching, if you've been enjoying the content, you have the opportunity to learn so much more and meet a lot of the people who have been on this podcast at the Ambitious Legacy event. It's going down April 23rd at the Mezzanine, which is the financial district in New York City. I will put the link to the tickets in the show notes and the description of the show so that you can get it. Don't miss this event. It's my very first event. So I'd love for you to come out and support and also get so much that we have in store for you. All right, let's get into the episode. So today I wanted to talk about an interesting story that I heard from a potential client that called. And I thought it would be very helpful to, because it has a lot of interesting stuff in it. But anyways, if you've been watching for a while, you probably heard me talk about trust and explain a little bit about what that's about. And maybe you're sort of like at the point where you're like, well, I already know that I want to trust and I just kind of want to learn as much as I can about it. Or you might be someone who's listening to this for the first time. So I'm just going to briefly explain like what a trust is and, what the benefit of it, is so that you have some context, right? So a trust is basically a document, right? And for all intents and purposes, it's a document that's created to allow you to transfer your assets to the next generation, right? We talk about generational wealth. That generational piece is actually the vehicle to help you transfer. It's also good in your life because if something happens to you, you get ill, you're not able to care for your assets, you have someone in place who's called a trustee. Initially, you would be that trustee, right? You'd be the one to continue to manage your assets the same way that you're doing now. You'll have full control over your assets. And if something were to happen to you, your successor, someone who takes over, will be that person to step in. And your successor would manage and run those assets for your beneficiary, whoever's going to benefit from your trust, right? Those are the basically key roles in the trust. And so it's that vehicle that gets it to the next generation. It, has instructions and rules as to how your assets should be passed down. Do you want it invested? Do you want it given to your kids at certain times? Do you, what do you want? You want to give it to charity? You want to start a business and, whatever. You are the boss. You get to rule and control. So that's what a trust is. And it really is helpful because it avoids your family having to go to court and deal with probate and lawsuits and all that stuff. So that's why people do it. And there's a lot more into that, but that's just a brief, sort of overview. Right. So what happened with this potential client, they called and said that they had an inheritance. Their grandparent had created a trust and left the assets in the trust or made the beneficiary of the trust their parent. And so their parent was a beneficiary of the trust, but unfortunately their parent passed away. So the young lady now, is the person who is next in line to receive those assets according to the trust, right? So the trust says, hey, I'm leaving everything to my son. My son's not around, then to my granddaughter, right? So she's in position to get it. So I'm like, wonderful. Your grandmother did a trust. She did what she had to do. She put a whole bunch of stuff in place. But then she says, yes. I'm like, so I'm trying to figure out what's the problem. She says now that the grandmother owns real estate. And I'm like, okay, cool. However, the real estate was not owned by the trust. It was in the grandmother's name and it was in title with someone else. So now, the web gets tangled, right? So what that means is because the trust did not actually own the real estate, that it was still in grandmother's name, the trust has no control. The trust cannot take the thing and give it to the person it belongs to because it has no control over it. It doesn't own it. What gets even more complicated is that because it was in grandma's name and she owned it with somebody else, now we have to see what does that deed look like? How do they own it? Because there are certain things, even if you put a will together or you put a trust together and you plan for your assets to go to someone specific, if you hold title to property in a certain way, which I kind of talked about this before in one of my other videos, it can bypass and go straight to someone else, right? So if you own property jointly with someone, When one of you dies, that property immediately goes to the person who is the co-owner. So I was like, oh no, I hope that's not the case. So we looked it up. That wasn't the case. It was actually tenants in common. So if it's tenants in common, that means when one person dies, their share still goes to their heirs. So that's a good thing in this case. So now what happens is, because uh, now that we figured out, okay, you still have a chance to get ownership of this property, because that was one of the most significant assets that grandmother had to leave. So now what has to be done is that the granddaughter now has to go to court, say, hey, my grandmother passed away. She has a trust. However, her property that was left to me was not owned by her trust. Thank God she also had what's called a pour over will. So now the pour over will is a companion to the trust. And what it does is it says, if I passed away, even though I have a trust, if there was something that I owned that was not transferred to my trust, this will is supposed to catch it and pour it into my trust, right? It's supposed to transfer it into my trust. So that's another good thing that grandmother did, right? She put a plan in place and she put a safety net in place just in case she didn't do all the steps, right? And so because she has this pour over will, it is a lot easier. It's going to be a lot quicker, a lot less costly for the granddaughter to actually get the property. But it is going to be a process, right? Because she didn't transfer it while she was alive. So she has to go to court, tell the court, hey, here's this will. It basically says that this property needs to now go into this trust. Once it's in the trust, it can then be transferred to the granddaughter because she's the beneficiary. And she also happens to be the trustee. So that means she herself, once she gets that property transferred, can just do a new deed and transfer it to herself. So the moral of the story here is basically that although you have the opportunity to do planning and put things in place, you want to always make sure that it's done correctly. And this is why I always caution against DIY, because especially this area of law, trust and estates and legacy planning and all that stuff, there's so many if then, or if something changes, then there's a different outcome or a different scenario. And then everybody's family situation is, different and has so many different layers to it that you could easily get tripped up. So, hey, if you want to, take your chance and do it, I'm not mad at you, but I'm just saying it probably makes more sense that you use a professional to go ahead and draft your documents and to do your plan. If you have like a very simple, straightforward situation, you certainly can try it. However, again, you won't know if something goes wrong until it's too late, right? Then your family's sort of left to pick up the pieces. All right, so while we know that creating a trust is an awesome way to transfer your assets, it's a really good tool. However, please understand that if all of your assets are not transferred to your trust, then you're not going to be getting the outcome that you're looking for. You're not going to be able to guarantee that your family members are going to receive your assets and that your wealth will be passed to the next generation. Okay? So, as a reminder, make sure you check the show notes, that you go ahead and get your tickets for the Ambitious Legacy event on April 23rd. It's approaching soon and tickets are going fast. And I can't wait to see you there and meet you guys in person.